Welcome to my channel, please like, subscribe and share. Ada's muffled cries echoed faintly in the cold, moonlit night as the two men dragged her toward an old, abandoned barn on the outskirts of Hilltown. The air was thick with tension, and the crunch of leaves beneath their hurried footsteps added to Ada's mounting dread. She struggled, her heart pounding in terror, but her captors' grips were firm, their intentions clear. Inside the barn, the men tied Ada to a wooden post, ensuring she couldn't escape. "Stay quiet," one of them barked, his face hidden by the shadows. The other man whispered urgently, "Let's get this over with and leave. If anyone finds us here, it'll be trouble." Ada, her wrists aching from the rough ropes, tried to calm her racing thoughts. The memory of Mrs. Rose's cold, calculating smile flashed in her mind. It all made sense now, this wasn't a random act. Her stepmother was behind this, determined to remove her from David's life at any cost. Meanwhile, David, growing increasingly concerned about Ada's absence, had been combing the village for any sign of her. The usual chatter of the marketplace had failed to distract him, and his unease only deepened when a vendor casually mentioned seeing two strange men leaving the James household late the previous night. Connecting the dots, David realized that something sinister was at play. Determined to find Ada, David enlisted the help of his trusted friend, Samuel, who had grown up in Hilltown and knew every hidden corner of the village. "If anyone can help me find her, it's you," David said, his voice heavy with urgency. Samuel nodded. "We'll find her. Let's start near the outskirts. That's where people tend to hide things they don't want others to see." As they approached the forest that bordered the village, David's keen eyes caught faint footprints in the dirt trail. "These look fresh," he muttered. Samuel inspected them closely. Two men, heavy-built, dragging something, or someone, he concluded grimly. The trail led them deeper into the forest, where the dim glow of a lantern in the distance caught their attention. David's heart raced as they approached the barn, the faint sound of muffled cries confirming his worst fears. Inside the barn, Ada strained against the ropes, her wrists raw and bleeding. Her captors, now arguing about their payment, were distracted. She spotted a jagged piece of metal on the floor nearby. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ada twisted her body, inching closer to the shard. The commotion outside startled the men. "Did you hear that?" one asked, drawing a knife from his belt. "Stay here. I'll check," the other replied, stepping toward the barn's entrance. David and Samuel waited silently, hidden behind a stack of hay bales. As the man emerged, Samuel tackled him, wresting the knife from his grip. David rushed past them, heading straight into the barn. The sight of Ada tied to the post fueled his determination. "Ada," he called, his voice cutting through her fear. Relief washed over her face as David untied her bonds. "We have to get out of here," he said, helping her to her feet. Just as they were about to leave, the second man lunged at David, his knife glinting in the lantern light. David dodged the attack, grappling with the man as Samuel joined the fray. In the chaos, Ada grabbed the discarded piece of metal and struck the man on the back of the head, rendering him unconscious. "Let's go," David urged, pulling Ada toward the forest. The trio disappeared into the shadows, leaving the barn behind as the men lay incapacitated. Back at Samuel's house, Ada recounted the events in shaky breaths. "It was Mrs. Rose," she said, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "She wanted me gone so Linda or Becky could have you." David's jaw tightened. "I won't let her get away with this. She will answer for what she's done." Samuel, ever the voice of reason, cautioned, "We need to be smart about this. Confronting her outright might make things worse. Let's gather proof of her involvement first." Ada nodded, her resolve hardening. She was no longer the timid girl who endured her stepmother's cruelty in silence. This time, she would fight back. The next morning, David and Samuel began their investigation. They questioned villagers who had seen the strange men near the James household and traced their movements back to a shady inn at the edge of Hilltown. There, they learned that the men were hired by a wealthy woman known for her sharp tongue and commanding demeanor. Meanwhile, Ada returned home under David's protection. Her sudden reappearance shocked Mrs. Rose, whose feigned concern couldn't mask the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Ada, where have you been? We were so worried," she exclaimed. Ada stared at her coldly. "You know exactly where I've been." Mrs. Rose's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Before Ada could respond, David stepped forward. "Enough lies, Mrs. Rose. We know what you've done, and we will make sure everyone else knows too." The color drained from Mrs. Rose's face as David's words sank in. For the first time, her grip on the household seemed to waver. As word of the incident spread, the villagers began to piece together the truth. Whispers of Mrs. Rose's cruelty and manipulation tarnished her once respected reputation. Linda and Becky, desperate to salvage their prospects, distanced themselves from their mother, though it was too late to escape the consequences. Mrs. Rose, cornered and desperate, devised one final plan to regain control. "If they want proof, I'll give them proof," she muttered to herself, her mind racing with schemes. Little did she know, her every move was being watched. David, Samuel, and Ada remained vigilant, knowing that Mrs. Rose wouldn't go down without a fight. The days that followed Ada's dramatic return were tense. Mrs. Rose, though outwardly calm, seethed with anger. Her carefully constructed plan had fallen apart, and the weight of suspicion pressed heavily on her shoulders. Ada, David, and Samuel, however, were not idle. They knew they needed more evidence to expose Mrs. Rose's actions and ensure she could no longer manipulate or harm anyone. David took the lead, approaching Hilltown's village council. These elders were respected figures who mediated disputes and upheld the community's moral fabric. At first, the council members were skeptical, finding it hard to believe that Mrs. Rose, a woman who had once appeared so dignified, could be behind such a heinous act. David, ever composed, laid out the initial findings, pointing to the testimonies of villagers who had seen the hired men. To strengthen their case, Samuel suggested an unlikely ally, Linda. Though selfish and vain, Linda had grown increasingly resentful of her mother's schemes. Her social standing had suffered since the rumors began, and she was desperate to salvage what remained of her reputation. "I'll speak to her," Ada offered. Her tone was firm, a stark contrast to the timid girl she had been. "If anyone can convince her, it's me." Ada found Linda sulking in her room, surrounded by half-packed bags and discarded dresses. The once proud girl looked defeated, her confidence shattered by the growing scandal. "Linda," Ada began, stepping into the room. "I need your help." Linda turned, her eyes narrowing. "Why would I help you? This is all your fault." "No, it's not," Ada replied evenly. "This is your mother's doing. She dragged you and Becky into this mess, and now she's dragging you down with her." Linda's lips quivered, but she said nothing. Ada pressed on. "If you testify to the council about what you know, it will help clear your name. People will see that you're not like her." Linda hesitated, her pride warring with her fear. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. But I'm doing this for me, not for you." "That's all I'm asking," Ada said, her expression softening. She reached out a hand, and after a moment, Linda shook it. With Linda's testimony, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She revealed details of Mrs. Rose's conversations with the hired men, and even produced a letter her mother had written, outlining her plan. It was the final nail in the coffin. David presented the evidence to the council, who summoned Mrs. Rose to answer for her actions. The hearing was held in the village square, drawing a large crowd. Whispers rippled through the gathered villagers as Mrs. Rose, flanked by Linda and Becky, approached the council table. The head councilman, a stern but fair elder named Elder Jonas, began the proceedings. Mrs. Rose, you stand accused of orchestrating the abduction of your stepdaughter, Ada James, with the intent to remove her from her rightful place in this family. How do you plead? Mrs. Rose, ever the actress, placed a hand on her chest. I am innocent, Elder Jonas. These accusations are nothing more than baseless rumors spread by jealous, spiteful people. Elder Jonas raised an eyebrow. Jealous of what, Mrs. Rose? Mrs. Rose faltered, her composure slipping. Of my family's status, of course. Ada has always been envious of my daughters. This is her way of trying to tarnish our name. David stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. With respect, Elder Jonas, the evidence speaks for itself. We have the testimony of villagers, the hired men's descriptions, and Linda's account of her mother's plans. Mrs. Rose's schemes go far beyond mere jealousy. Linda, visibly nervous, stepped forward. It's true, she said, her voice trembling. I overheard my mother planning to have Ada taken away. She said it was the only way to secure our future. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Rose glared at Linda, her eyes blazing with fury. You ungrateful child. After everything I've done for you. Enough, Elder Jonas interrupted, his tone sharp. Mrs. Rose, do you deny writing this letter? He held up the incriminating document. Mrs. Rose's face turned ashen. For the first time, she seemed truly cornered. I didn't mean for it to go that far, she stammered. I only wanted what was best for my daughters. Elder Jonas nodded solemnly. And in doing so, you endangered the life of an innocent young woman. Your actions are inexcusable. After hours of deliberation, the council delivered their decision. Mrs. Rose was to be stripped of her standing in the village, and sentenced to a year of labor in service to the community. The council deemed it a fitting punishment for someone who had abused her position for personal gain. As Mrs. Rose was led away, the crowd began to disperse. Linda and Becky stood silently, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and relief. Ada, watching from the sidelines, felt a wave of emotions, vindication, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, the James household underwent a transformation. Without Mrs. Rose's oppressive presence, the atmosphere grew lighter. Linda and Becky, though still grappling with the fallout of their mother's actions, began to show signs of change. They even offered to help Ada with the chores, a small but significant gesture. David, ever supportive, stood by Ada's side. You've been through so much, he said one evening as they walked through the village. But you never gave up. That's what I admire most about you. Ada smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew she wasn't alone. Hilltown seemed quieter in the days after Mrs. Rose's sentencing. The gossip and tension that had gripped the village began to subside, and Ada found herself navigating a new life without her stepmother's oppressive shadow. But beneath the surface of this newfound calm, an undercurrent of unease remained. Mrs. Rose might have been stripped of her status, but her cunning was far from extinguished. David, ever vigilant, ensured Ada's safety by frequently visiting the James household. His presence brought comfort, but Ada couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Rose's chapter in her life wasn't truly closed. Each creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind made her heart race, as if the shadows still held secrets waiting to emerge. One morning, as Ada tended to the garden, Linda approached her with a hesitant expression. "Ada," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft, I want to apologize." Ada looked up, surprised. Linda had rarely spoken to her since the council hearing. "For what?" "For everything," Linda admitted, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I let Mother's hatred blind me. I didn't see how wrong we were to treat you the way we did. You didn't deserve any of it." Ada studied her stepsister's face, searching for sincerity. What she saw wasn't just guilt, but genuine remorse. Slowly, she nodded. "Thank you, Linda. That means a lot." The two stood in silence for a moment before Linda added, "I overheard something that I think you should know." Ada's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "It's about Mother. She's been talking to someone she used to know before Father married her. I don't know who, but I think she's planning something." David was the first person Ada confided in about Linda's revelation. They sat together in the shade of an old oak tree, the air between them heavy with concern. "If Mrs. Rose has someone helping her, it could mean trouble," David said, his brow furrowed. "Do you think Linda is telling the truth?" "I think so," Ada replied. "She's changed since the hearing. I don't think she would lie about something like this." David nodded. "We'll have to be careful. Whoever this person is, they might try to undermine everything we've worked to uncover." That evening, David and Samuel set out to investigate. They visited the tavern where Mrs. Rose had frequently met with the hired men. It was a seedy establishment, filled with shadows and whispers. Samuel approached the barkeep, sliding a coin across the counter. "We are looking for someone who's been meeting with Mrs. Rose. Got any names?" The barkeep hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "She's been talking to a man named Victor. Used to live here years ago, but he's been keeping a low profile lately." David leaned in. "Where can we find him?" The barkeep gestured toward the back of the tavern. "He's staying in one of the rooms upstairs. But be careful, Victor isn't the kind of man you want to cross." David and Samuel climbed the narrow staircase, their footsteps muffled by the worn wooden boards. When they reached the door the barkeep had indicated, Samuel knocked. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes. "What do you want?" Victor asked, his voice low and wary. "We need to talk," David said. "It's about Mrs. Rose." Victor's expression darkened. "I don't know anything about her." Samuel crossed his arms, blocking the doorway. "We know you've been meeting with her. If you're smart, you'll tell us what she's planning." Victor hesitated, his gaze flickering between the two men. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing them into the room. "You've got 5 minutes," he said gruffly. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single bed and a small table cluttered with papers. David's eyes scanned the table, noting a map of Hilltown marked with several red circles. "What's this?" David asked, pointing to the map. Victor stiffened. "None of your business." "It becomes our business when it involves Ada," David retorted. "She's been through enough. If you're helping Mrs. Rose hurt her again, we won't stand for it." Victor sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Look, I don't know all the details. Mrs. Rose hired me to keep an eye on things. She said she wanted to make sure Ada stayed in line." "Stayed in line?" Samuel repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. She's not satisfied with ruining her life, now she wants to control it too. Victor shrugged. I'm just doing what I'm paid to do. But if you're smart, you'll keep out of it. Mrs. Rose doesn't like losing. David stepped closer, his voice low and firm. You're done working for her. If we catch wind of anything else, you'll answer to more than just us. Victor held up his hands defensively. Fine. I'll back off. But you should know, she's not the kind of woman to give up easily. Armed with this new information, David and Samuel returned to the James household to warn Ada. She listened intently as they recounted their encounter with Victor, her expression growing more resolute with each word. She's desperate, Ada said. That makes her dangerous. We have to be ready for whatever she tries next. David reached for her hand, his grip steady and reassuring. We'll face it together. She won't win. Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Rose's influence, though diminished, lingered like a shadow over Ada's life. Her most recent attempt to control Ada had been thwarted, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. Victor's departure from Hilltown had created a temporary reprieve, yet the tension remained palpable. David and Samuel, ever cautious, decided to monitor Mrs. Rose's activities closely. They took shifts ensuring she wasn't meeting anyone suspicious or making arrangements that could put Ada in danger. Meanwhile, Ada focused on rebuilding her life, determined not to let her stepmother's schemes define her future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a messenger arrived at the James household with a sealed letter for Ada. The sight of the envelope, bearing no markings or name, sent a chill down her spine. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she read the cryptic message. Meet me at the old mill tonight. Come alone. There are things you need to know. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the ambiguity of the message left Ada uneasy. David, upon hearing about the letter, immediately objected. It's too dangerous, he said. You're not going alone. But what if it's important? Ada countered. What if it's someone trying to help? Samuel, ever the strategist, interjected. We'll let her go, but not alone. We'll stay close enough to intervene if anything happens. Reluctantly, David agreed. That night, as Ada made her way to the old mill, David and Samuel followed discreetly, keeping to the shadows. The old mill stood on the outskirts of Hilltown, its decaying structure illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. As Ada stepped inside, her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. A figure emerged from the darkness, their face obscured by a hood. Ada, the figure said, their voice low and gravelly. You've been through more than anyone should endure. Who are you? Ada asked, her voice steady despite her fear. The figure removed their hood, revealing an older woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. My name is Evelyn. I was once like you, another pawn in Mrs. Rose's games. Ada's breath caught. What do you mean? Evelyn stepped closer, her expression softening. Years ago, I was Mrs. Rose's maid. I saw everything, her manipulation, her lies, and the lengths she would go to for power and control. I tried to speak out, but she ruined my reputation and forced me to leave Hilltown. Why are you telling me this now? Ada asked, her voice trembling. Because you have the strength to stop her, Evelyn said. I've been watching, and I see how much she fears you. She knows that if you expose her completely, she'll lose everything. Evelyn handed Ada a small bundle of papers. These are letters, accounts, and records of her dealings, proof of everything she's done. Use them wisely. Before Ada could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the mill. Evelyn's eyes widened. You need to go. Now? Ada turned and ran, clutching the bundle tightly. Outside, David and Samuel rushed to her side. What happened? David asked, his concern evident. Later, Ada panted. We need to leave. Armed with Evelyn's evidence, Ada, David, and Samuel returned to the village council. Elder Jonas, though initially skeptical, reviewed the documents carefully. His expression grew graver with each passing moment. This is damning, he said finally. If this is true, Mrs. Rose's actions go beyond mere cruelty, they are criminal. The council convened an emergency hearing, summoning Mrs. Rose to answer for the new evidence. The villagers gathered once more, their curiosity mingled with outrage as whispers of her misdeeds spread. Mrs. Rose arrived, her demeanor as cold and calculating as ever. But as Elder Jonas began to read the charges against her, her confidence began to crumble. Each letter, each record, painted a damning picture of a woman who had manipulated, coerced, and betrayed those around her for years. When it was Ada's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice unwavering. Mrs. Rose has caused me and others unimaginable pain. But despite everything, I stand here today not out of hatred, but out of a desire for justice. No one else should suffer because of her. The crowd erupted into applause, their support for Ada undeniable. Mrs. Rose, now pale and visibly shaken, had no defense. The council found her guilty of multiple counts of fraud, coercion, and endangerment. Her punishment was exile from Hilltown, a fate worse than imprisonment for someone who thrived on power and influence. With Mrs. Rose gone, the James household began to heal. Linda and Becky, humbled by the events, made genuine efforts to mend their relationship with Ada. Though it would take time, Ada welcomed their attempts with an open heart. David and Ada grew closer, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. One evening, as they walked through the now peaceful village, David took Ada's hand and said, "You've shown me what true strength looks like. Whatever the future holds, I want to face it with you." Ada smiled, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt free, not just from Mrs. Rose's cruelty, but from the weight of the past. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her hope. As the sun set over Hilltown, casting its golden glow over the village, Ada knew that this was not the end of her story. It was a new beginning, one filled with promise, resilience, and the unwavering belief that kindness and courage could overcome even the darkest of shadows. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.